Some Porsche 911s are easy to drive, ready to use every day, sensible, almost as six-figure performance cars go anyways. Like this Carrera with its 400 horsepower. Other Porsche 911s like this Turbo S are more like an all-season hot rod supercar. You get all-wheel drive and 560 horsepower here, which is a lot. There are more than a dozen 911 models to pick from. You've got Carreras and Turbos and Targas and 4Ss and Cabriolets, but none of those are more all-out exhilarating to drive as this one, the 911 GT3. Unlike the rest of the 911 models that are designed to be used comfortably every day on the road or the racetrack, this one's packed full of exclusive upgrades and targeted engineering efforts that aim to make it, basically, a street-legal race car. Porsche says that 80% of people who own one will go race it on weekends. You see clues about that all over. This front lip won't even clear a coffee cup. The ultra-high-end tires are over a foot wide in the back and have fuzzy black felt on their sidewalls to make the lettering stand out. They're set wider apart from one another than in a regular 911 too for more grip. And the whole thing is lowered over an inch. Inside there's a lap timer on the dash, a G-force meter in the instruments, and thin, stiff, and grippy seats. And special controls to put the transmission, suspension, and traction assist systems into their high-performance calibrations at the touch of a button. It's rear-wheel drive only too, so it's a friskier thing to drive hard than its all-wheel drive siblings. The GT3 is actually so fast the speedometer counts by 50s. There are big, massive brakes with holes drilled in them and wheels bolted onto the car with a single central locking nut, which saves weight. Weight saving is a big thing with the GT3 since making a car lighter is a great way to make it handle better, go faster, and use less fuel. So they've also eliminated things like the rear seat, the heavy motorized rear spoiler in place of this massive fixed wing with integrated engine air intake instead. Yes, the spoiler is an air intake. And none of that visual stuff is an empty threat. Driving the GT3, you get the sense every time you give it an input that it's fine-tuned down to the very last detail to be a machine that's always telling its driver what's going on. The steering, for instance, is absolutely razor sharp, among the most precise I've ever used, and it does a great job of communicating the traction situation to the driver. If you're losing front-end grip, you'll feel it in your fingertips. Plus, it's so heavy you'll almost forget there's no engine above the front wheels. There's rear-wheel steering, too, to help with agility on a circuit and maneuverability in tight spaces. And you feel the suspension, first because it's very stiff, and second because when you're driving it a bit hard, you can feel virtually where the GT3 has traction and how its body is sitting on the wheels, and even a little squirm, shift, or slide here and there when you power hard out of a corner. Like the steering, the rest of the chassis is all about feel. Some of the stuff you're isolated from in other 911 models is proudly on display here. GT3 gets a 3.8-liter flat-six engine mounted low in the back. There are no turbochargers, but from that 3.8 liters, it spins up 475 horsepower, and they're all fantastic and of the very high revving variety. The redline on this extreme performance engine is a simply whopping 9,000 RPM. Lesser engines would have flung themselves apart long before those sort of revs, and the sound? The last 1,000 RPM at full throttle here sees a mechanical zing like nothing I've ever heard from an engine, drown out even the intake howls so loudly you'll think it was being transmitted right into your brain. And listen to those gear shifts. The dual-clutch Porsche PDK transmission is the only one offered. A manual would slow this car down too much, but special gear ratios and tuning for this gearbox match the high-revving character of the engine, meaning the red line is always within striking distance and that gear changes happen in literal fractions of a second, sometimes with almost violent ferocity. It's all part of a remarkable driving experience and one that's somewhat wasted if you're only driving your GT3 on the road. All said, this has got to be one of the most beautifully haywire driver's cars that I've ever driven. And I mean driver's car in the pure sense of the word. The way that this performs and feels at your fingertips is really second to none. But unlike the rest of the 911 model range, and I've driven most of it, there are some key differences here. In any other 911, you get the sense that there's a little bit of practicality, sensibility, that you could drive the car 365 days a year without worrying too much about it. In this, that's not so much the case. There's a lot of stuff that you worry about driving the GT3, like whacking that front bumper off on something low to the ground, or blowing out one of those super exotic tires, or the fact that you can't see much out of that rear view mirror because of the massive wing. And that's an issue in a car like this if someone's behind you that might be interested in giving you a speeding ticket. But I think ultimately the best and worst part about this car altogether are how this engine delivers its performance on such a furious wave all the way past 9,000 RPM. That's the best part about the car because, well, that's awesome, but it's the worst part about it because it does 120 kilometers an hour in second gear, and there are 5 gears to go after that. So translation, you just can't use most of this car's capability most of the time. It's going to make the best return on an investment if you've got a racetrack nearby and plan to use it. You can drive it on the road though. It's probably the least comfortable 911 I've ever driven, but it could get away with being stiffer, louder, and less accommodating. After a few highway trips, I had no real complaints other than wishing for a slightly larger fuel tank for less frequent refueling stops. Plus you get navigation and automatic lights and automatic climate control, helping add to the comfort factor on the road. So let's sum up this four-wheeled 475 horsepower 9,000 RPM red rocket toy, shall we? You'll like the looks, the exclusivity, the absolutely hardcore track-ready performance, and the gorgeous furious engine. And if you're okay with letting most of the performance go to waste, you can drive it around too, no problem, if you're careful. What's not to like? Basically the stress level of driving a GT3 on rough roads, the numerous compromises, and the very high likelihood that your local police force is going to pay very close attention to you. End of the day, this is a tricky sort of car to sum up. In the real world with its speed limits and fellow motorists and police with radar guns, I figure most of what this car can do will go to waste most of the time. That said, it is the most badass, crowd-gathering, and haywire 911 going, and that's going to help sell a lot of copies to the folks with the funds, and hopefully a nearby racing course to maximize their value from this machine. Pricing, as tested, you're looking at about 165 grand. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Stay in school, kids. One more sound up.